When you look at a structurally compromised skyscraper, the entire story of its failure is usually written right there in the rust.
Right, it's highly visible.
Yeah, you see the physical decay, the corroded foundational beams, the shattered glass, the creeping neglect that spans decades. The architect can just point at the rotting steel and say, well, that is why it fell.
Because the decline is observable, it's progressive, and above all, it's highly predictable. It is a linear decay. We've really been conditioned to expect failure to look like failure long before the final collapse actually happens.
Exactly. But when you step into the aggressive, just hyper-accelerated environment of the 1980s and 1990s technology boom, that predictable linear decay completely vanishes.
It just doesn't exist in that space.
No, it doesn't. We are examining a corporate landscape that is incredibly unforgiving. It's a world where a multi-billion-dollar structure can look absolutely pristine, dominant, and unassailable one day, and then just entirely collapse under its own weight the next.
And that brings us to today's subject.
Right. Welcome to a brand new investigation for Peak to Dust. Today, we are conducting a highly detailed, deeply analytical corporate autopsy of one of the most meteoric, powerful companies in the history of technology, Compaq Computer Corporation.
And this is such a critical historical examination. We're pulling from a massive stack of sources today: corporate histories, business case studies, technology retrospectives, internal press releases, the whole spectrum.
Because our mission for this deep dive is to trace a trajectory that is almost unmatched in modern business. We are going to map Compaq's unprecedented rise from literally a hasty sketch on a pie shop placemat to the absolute, undisputed pinnacle of the personal computer industry.
But more importantly, we are going to dissect the anatomy of their downfall. The first half of this investigation is about staggering innovation and market dominance.
Yeah, and the second half is a grim unraveling. It's strategic missteps, brutal supply chain realities, and seismic market shifts that dismantled an empire.
And to the listener, this isn't just some nostalgic look back at vintage hardware. This is a masterclass in how disruptive innovation actually functions under pressure.
Absolutely. It's an exploration of the double-edged sword of championing open standards in a proprietary world. And ultimately, it serves as a stark cautionary tale for you about exactly how quickly industry giants can be erased when they lose sight of their core identity.
So to understand the magnitude of the collapse, we first have to understand the sheer velocity of the ascent.
Right.
The genesis of Compaq begins in 1981, and honestly, it begins with frustration. We have three senior managers working at Texas Instruments: Rod Canyon, Jim Harris, and Bill Murto.
And these guys are seasoned engineers.
Right, very seasoned. But they are feeling completely stifled by the massive, slow-moving corporate bureaucracy at TI. They decide they need to leave and start their own venture. But initially, they don't even know what that venture should be.
Looking at the sources, they were throwing incredibly disparate ideas at the wall. They seriously considered opening a Mexican restaurant in Houston.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. Or they looked at manufacturing specialized storage devices for mini computers. They even toyed with the idea of building those little beeping key finders for consumers.
But their attention just kept drifting back to the rapidly shifting landscape of personal computing. Specifically, they were watching the rising dominance of the IBM personal computer.
Right. The IBM PC was changing everything.
It was. And they were also looking at this early portable computer called the Osborne 1. They realized the Osborne had a brilliant form factor. It was luggage size, you could actually carry it, but it had one fatal, insurmountable flaw.
It was completely incompatible with IBM software.
Exactly. And that specific realization is the bedrock upon which the entire Compaq empire was built.
So to truly grasp the gravity of this, we need to contextualize the computing landscape of the early 1980s for you. It was a completely fractured ecosystem.
A total nightmare for consumers. At that time, hardware companies fiercely protected their proprietary architectures. Software written for one specific machine would absolutely not boot on a competitor's machine.
Sometimes, software wouldn't even work on a different model from the exact same manufacturer.
Right. It was a siloed nightmare for corporate consumers and independent software developers alike.
So, okay, let's unpack this. If a business bought accounting software for an Apple machine and then wanted to switch to a Commodore or a Tandy, they couldn't just reinstall the software.
No, they had to buy entirely new software, retrain all their staff, and manually migrate their data.
Massive vendor lock-in.
Astronomical switching costs. But then IBM released their PC, and they took a highly unusual approach for a company that was historically known for proprietary mainframes.
Oh.
IBM built their personal computer using off-the-shelf standardized parts,
Right, they bought the microprocessor from Intel. They licensed the operating system, MS-DOS, from a small Seattle company called Microsoft.
which meant anyone could theoretically buy those exact same parts. But IBM tightly guarded and legally weaponized one specific, highly proprietary component, the BIOS, or Basic Input-Output System.
Let's drill down into the mechanics of the BIOS, because this is the holy grail of early 90s computing. Why was this single chip the bottleneck for the entire industry?
Think of the BIOS as this critical translation layer, like the central nervous system of the computer. It literally sits right between the software and the physical hardware.
Okay.
When a program, say Lotus 123, wants to display a number on the screen or save a file to a floppy disk, the software doesn't actually know how to physically spin the disk drive or light up the pixels.
It sends a command.
Right, it sends a standardized request and interrupt code to the BIOS, and then the BIOS translates that request into the specific electrical signals required by the hardware.
So every single piece of business software being written for the IBM PC was hard-coded to talk exclusively to the IBM BIOS. They expected the IBM BIOS to be sitting there ready to catch those specific requests.
Exactly. If you built a computer with the same Intel chip and the same Microsoft OS, but you didn't have IBM's exact BIOS, the software would send a request, receive an unexpected response, and just crash.
And IBM held an ironclad legal copyright on the source code of their BIOS.
They absolutely did. Early clone manufacturers tried to just physically copy the IBM ROM chip, or they read the IBM technical manuals and copied the interrupt codes directly. And IBM's lawyers moved in with devastating speed, shut them down instantly with copyright infringement lawsuits.
Which meant if Canyon, Harris, and Murtaugh wanted to build a portable computer, that businesses would actually buy a machine that was 100% compatible with the rapidly growing library of IBM software, they had to find a way to circumvent the copyright.
They had to achieve the exact same software outcomes without ever copying a single line of IBM's protected code.
And this brings us to the clean room strategy, which is just one of the most brilliant pieces of corporate and legal engineering in tech history.
The clean room reverse engineering process was a massive gamble. The internal accounts detail how a senior Compaq engineer named Gary Stimac was dispatched to a computer store in Dallas to purchase the official IBM technical reference manuals. Stimac opens the manual and immediately realizes he has stepped into a brilliantly laid legal trap. IBM hadn't hidden their code. They had actually published the exact line-by-line source code of their proprietary BIOS right there in the appendix of the manual.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Why would they publish the secret recipe? That seems incredibly counterintuitive if you're trying to protect it.
Because it was a legal landmine. By publishing it, IBM ensured that any engineer working for a competitor who bought the manual to understand the system would inevitably see the code.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The moment Stimac's eyes passed over that source code, he was legally tainted. He could never write the Compaq BIOS because IBM could easily drag him into court, point to the manual, and successfully argue that his code was derived from their copyrighted material.
So Compaq realizes they can't just have their best engineers figure it out because their best engineers are now legally compromised just by looking at the book.
Precisely. This forces them to establish two completely isolated teams. Team A, which we can call the dirty team, included Stimac. They read the IBM manual, they analyzed the copyrighted code, and they wrote out highly detailed technical specifications.
But just the specs, right?
Right. These specs could only describe what the BIOS was supposed to do: its inputs, its expected behaviors, and its outputs. They were strictly forbidden from including any actual code or structural logic in these documents.
And then you have Team B, the clean team, locked away in the clean room.
Exactly. This team consisted of entirely different engineers who had absolutely never seen the IBM manual, never seen the original source code, and were legally isolated from Team A. Team B's entire job was to write brand new code entirely from scratch, based solely on the functional specifications provided by Team A.
It's like trying to perfectly recreate a Michelin star chef's patented recipe. But you aren't allowed to see the recipe, you aren't allowed to talk to the chef, and you aren't even allowed to look at or taste the final dish.
That's a great way to put it.
You're just handed a list of raw ingredients and a highly clinical description of the chemical reactions that are supposed to happen on the customer's palate. And from that, you have to invent an entirely new cooking process from scratch that miraculously results in the exact same flavor profile.
That is a highly accurate parallel. And the process for Team B was just agonizing. It was pure trial and error. They would write a custom BIOS, load up a popular IBM-compatible program like Flight Simulator, which was notoriously finicky because it bypassed standard DOS calls and talked directly to the hardware, and then they just wait for it to crash.
And then when it crashed,
They had to isolate exactly which hardware call failed, rewrite their custom code to handle that specific edge case, and try again. And through this painstaking blind iteration, they achieved an astonishing 95% compatibility with the IBM software library.
which was unheard of. No other company on the market was even close to that metric.
And this isn't just a neat technical trick. This fundamentally altered the trajectory of the personal computing industry. Because if IBM's lawyers had successfully crushed Compaq's clean room defense in 1982, the legal precedent would have cemented a closed ecosystem forever.
We would have lived in a world where you had to buy a specific brand of proprietary hardware just to run a specific word processor.
But Compaq's legal and engineering victory forced the entire industry toward a unified, open hardware standard.
Right. And armed with this legally bulletproof, fully compatible BIOS, Compaq unleashed their product on the market. In November 1982, they officially released the Compaq Portable.
The sewing machine computer.
Literally, it weighed 28 pounds, it was the size of a sewing machine, and it was an absolute revelation. The internal projections from the founders estimated they might hit $30 million in sales in their first year if everything went perfectly.
And industry analysts thought even that was dangerously arrogant.
Oh, yeah. They thought Canyon was out of his mind. But the reality absolutely shattered those projections. In its first full year on the market, the Compaq Portable sold 53,000 units. It generated $111.2 million in top-line revenue.
That is staggering. That wasn't just a tech success. That was an American business record for a company's first-year sale.
It was unprecedented. By 1986, Compaq reached the Fortune 500 in under 4 years, making them the fastest company in history to achieve that milestone at the time.
The financial velocity of this era is just hard to wrap your head around, but we really have to dissect why they won so decisively. They were not simply riding in IBM's wake as a cheap imitator.
No, in the rapidly expanding clone market, the standard playbook was to compete relentlessly on price, build a cheap knockoff, undercut IBM by a few $100s, and capture the low end of the market. Compaq rejected that model entirely.
They positioned themselves as a premium brand. They competed on engineering value, not just price.
Exactly. Their machines were rugged. They offered genuine portability, obviously, but they also engineered better graphics displays and significantly higher overall performance than the IBM equivalents.
And this was driven by their hiring strategy. The sources show they weren't a garage startup pulling all-nighters with 20-somethings.
Right. They had adult supervision. When their first product hit the market, their technical staff had an average of 15 years of industry experience. They were hiring veteran engineers from Texas Instruments, from IBM itself, from major defense contractors.
They were building highly reliable enterprise-grade machines that corporate IT directors actually felt safe buying.
That enterprise reliability was crucial for wooing corporate buyers away from the safety of the IBM badge. But their market dominance was equally secured by a massive strategic pillar on the logistics side, their retail dealer network.
Yes, the dealers.
While other young, hungry clone companies like Dell and Gateway were beginning to experiment with direct-to-consumer marketing, selling computers over toll-free 1-800 phone lines directly to end users, Compaq committed their entire structural identity to authorized independent retailers.
They built an absolute fortress out of retail loyalty. They instituted this massive partner program called SalesPack.
SalesPack was huge. Compaq would pay a significant percentage of a dealer's local advertising and employee training costs.
But the cornerstone of this relationship was basically a blood oath. Compaq swore they would never, ever bypass the dealers to sell direct. They guaranteed the retailers that they would not compete with their own distribution channels.
And in the 1980s, before widespread internet commerce, the retail shelf was the absolute choke point of the industry. By guaranteeing dealer margins and refusing to sell direct, Compaq secured the premium front-of-store shelf space in almost every major computer retailer in the country.
The dealers actively pushed Compaq machines over competitors because they knew Compaq was protecting their business model.
It was a symbiotic monopoly. So they have premium engineering and they have total control of the retail channel. But their true dominance over IBM was cemented by their aggressive, almost reckless product development cycle.
Because IBM operated on traditional mainframe timelines.
Right.
Yeah.
Years of slow, methodical research development and just
endless bureaucratic approvals before a product saw the light of day. Compaq compressed the entire product cycle to a staggering 6 to 9 months.
The ultimate proof of this agility, and really the moment Compaq truly usurped IBM as the technological leader of the industry, arrived in 1986.
Yes, Intel had just finished developing a groundbreaking new 32-bit microprocessor, the 8386. It was a massive leap forward in computing architecture.
Intel desperately wanted to get it into the market to establish the new standard.
But IBM, bogged down in their internal development cycles, told Intel they weren't ready to build a machine around it yet.
But Compaq was ready. They partnered directly with Intel. I mean, Compaq's seasoned engineers actually worked alongside Intel to identify and correct microcode defects in the new chip itself.
And in September 1986, Compaq launched the Desk Pro 386. This is the inflection point. The Desk Pro 386 hit the market a full 9 months before IBM could manage to get a comparable 386 machine onto the shelves.
9 months in tech is a lifetime. And the Compaq machine performed 3 times faster than IBM's best available PC at the time.
Compaq was no longer just cloning IBM's architecture. They were defining the cutting edge. They were dragging the entire industry forward while IBM played catch-up.
Now, we have to look closely at the corporate culture that was supposedly driving this unprecedented speed, because the historical accounts of Compaq during this era describe the sprawling, wooded, West Coast-style corporate campus in Houston.
Very anti-IBM.
Yeah, they heavily promoted a consensus-based management style. Every single division, engineering, marketing, manufacturing, sales, had an equal say in product development. They had identical, equal-size offices for everyone.
No reserved parking spots.
Not even for CEO Rod Canyon. But I look at that and I have to challenge the narrative.
Okay, let's hear it.
You have thousands of employees, no strict top-down hierarchy, everyone has to agree, and yet they are pumping out revolutionary hardware in 6 months. How is that operationally possible? Was it actually this egalitarian culture driving the innovation? Or did they just have such massive, unprecedented cash flow that they could afford to brute force their way through engineering bottlenecks?
It's a really critical structural question. The evidence indicates that during this specific era of hypergrowth, the culture and the speed were highly symbiotic. Because they used a consensus management approach, it meant that the factories were being retooled, the marketing campaigns were being designed, and the retail distribution logistics were being finalized simultaneously while the engineers were still refining the final product design.
Ah, so there were no sequential handoffs where one department waited for another to finish.
Right. Everyone was at the table from day one. It was parallel processing, but on a corporate organizational level.
That makes sense.
However, the vulnerability in that system is exactly what you alluded to. Consensus-based management works beautifully when you are the undisputed market leader, when you have a relatively narrow, highly focused product line, and when you are operating with massive, comfortable profit margins.
Sure, everyone gets along when the stock is splitting and the bonuses are massive.
Exactly. But that exact same cultural structure becomes a fatal liability when the market dynamics shift, when profit margins collapse, and when the company requires ruthless cost-cutting and rapid unilateral pivoting. As we will see, a culture designed for peacetime expansion is wholly unequipped for trench warfare.
And the trench warfare was about to begin. Because IBM, a corporate titan that was accustomed to absolute monopolistic control of the computing market, was not going to simply allow this Texas upstart to continually humiliate them.
No, IBM decided to stop competing on Compaq's terms. In 1987, they tried to flip the board over and rewrite the fundamental rules of the industry entirely.
IBM introduced a radically new line of computers called the Personal System 2, or PS2.
But the hardware itself wasn't the weapon. The weapon was the internal bus structure, the pathway that allowed the processor to communicate with expansion cards like network adapters or advanced graphics cards. IBM introduced a closed, heavily patented, proprietary bus called microchannel architecture, or MCA.
IBM's strategy here was ruthless and transparent. They wanted to cut the legs out from under all the clone manufacturers by making the core hardware architecture legally protected and strictly licensed.
They were trying to return the industry to the proprietary control they enjoyed during the mainframe era. The systemic threat to the industry cannot be overstated here.
Right. If IBM successfully forced the corporate market to adopt MCA as the new standard, the existing clone manufacturers, including Compaq, would be forced to pay exorbitant, punitive licensing fees to IBM for every single machine they built.
Assuming IBM even allowed them to license the technology at all. But there was a massive structural barrier in IBM's way.
The legacy software trap. By 1987, Corporations globally had invested an estimated $12 billion in IBM PC-compatible software and peripheral hardware designed for the older, open 16-bit AT-bus architecture.
Exactly. And the new proprietary MCA architecture was entirely physically and electronically incompatible with the older AT-bus design.
So if a massive financial institution or a global logistics firm wanted to upgrade their hardware to IBM's new MCA standard, they would have to throw away their entire existing inventory of expansion cards.
Not to mention, software developers would have to double their engineering budgets to write and support software for two entirely different competing architectures.
It was an incredibly arrogant move by IBM, banking purely on the historical weight of their brand to force the market to absorb those astronomical switching costs. And Compaq refused to bend the knee.
Compaq looked at the landscape and calculated that corporate America would not willingly abandon a $12 billion sunk cost. So Compaq leveraged its massive market influence and led an open rebellion.
They orchestrated the formation of a consortium that the tech press dubbed the Gang of Nine.
Right, this included major industry players: Zenith, Tandy, Hewlett-Packard, Olivetti, NESC, AST Research, Epson, and YSC. Under Compaq's leadership, this consortium funded, engineered, and launched an alternative non-proprietary standard called ISA, Extended Industry Standard Architecture.
And the brilliant, lethal part of ISA was that it was a 32-bit architecture that was fully backward compatible with the millions of older 16-bit expansion cards currently sitting in corporate offices around the world.
And Compaq didn't patent it. They opened the engineering specifications to absolutely anyone who wanted to build for it.
It was a masterstroke of systemic industry politics. By championing the open ISA standard, Compaq guaranteed that peripheral manufacturers, independent software developers, and corporate IT directors could upgrade their network speeds and hardware capabilities without sacrificing their legacy investments.
And the market response was devastating to IBM. Consumers and enterprise buyers overwhelmingly rejected the closed, expensive MCA system and fully embraced the open, compatible ISA standard.
Total victory for Compaq. Within a few years, IBM was forced into a humiliating capitulation, quietly adopting the open standards they had just spent billions to kill.
But as we transition from this era of absolute peak dominance into the unraveling of the empire, we have to analyze the systemic consequences of this standard war.
Yeah, let me ask you, was Compaq actually acting as a selfless champion of the consumer here, democratizing technology, or were they just a massive corporation protecting their own profit margins?
Oh, it was an act of pure, calculated corporate self-preservation. But the secondary systemic effects of that self-preservation permanently altered the balance of power in the tech industry. That specific standard war over the bus architecture was the exact historical moment that power shifted away from hardware system manufacturers like IBM and eventually Compaq itself, and shifted directly to the component suppliers.
Right, because standardizing the architecture inherently commoditizes the final product.
Precisely. By ensuring that the architecture remained fundamentally open and standardized, Compaq inadvertently crowned Intel and Microsoft as the true, untouchable monarchs of the industry.
Because if the architecture is strictly open and standardized, then anyone with a supply chain can buy an Intel microprocessor, license a copy of Microsoft Windows, screw them into a metal chassis, and build a fully functional, highly capable machine.
And this intense democratization of the PC industry was exactly what Compaq fought for to defeat IBM's proprietary threat. But it would soon invite a swarm of lean, aggressive predators that Compaq's bloated premium infrastructure was entirely unprepared to fight.
And that brings us to the year 1991, where the facade of invincibility cracks. A severe worldwide economic recession and the uncertainty of the Persian Gulf War hit the global economy hard.
Corporate IT budgets just freeze.
And Compaq is forced to announce something that sends shockwaves through Wall Street, a $70 million third-quarter loss. For the first time in the company's meteoric history, their sales and earnings don't just slow down, they actively contract.
The reaction inside the Compaq boardroom was swift and brutal. The era of consensus and patience evaporated overnight. Chairman Ben Rosen, the venture capitalist, who originally funded the pie shop placemat sketch, orchestrated a boardroom coup.
He ousted co-founder and CEO Rod Canyon, the man who built the company.
Rosen replaced him with Eckhard Pfeiffer, a hard-charging executive who had previously run Compaq's highly successful European operations.
Pfeiffer took control and immediately recognized that the market physics had fundamentally changed. The premium pricing model, charging thousands of dollars extra simply for the Compaq badge and superior engineering, was being hollowed out by a wave of cheaper, highly capable clone competitors.
Pfeiffer's response was severe.
He initiated a massive restructuring, executing a 1,440-person staff reduction, which severed roughly 12% of the entire global workforce. 5 high-ranking senior executives were forced out.
Pfeiffer aggressively slashed retail prices across the board to stop the hemorrhaging of their market share. But more importantly, he initiated a massive, highly focused strategic push down market directly into the rapidly expanding consumer and home office demographics.
He knew the era of relying solely on massive corporate IT contracts was over. That strategic pivot materialized in August 1993 with the launch of the Presario line.
The Presario was aimed directly at households. It was bundled with consumer-friendly software. It featured built-in modems for online services. And crucially, it was priced under $1,500.
It was an absolute retail phenomenon. Fueled by a massive $12 million television advertising blitz, they sold 100,000 Presario units in the first 60 days. In 1993 alone, Compaq moved $500 million worth of Presarios.
The sheer volume was staggering. By 1994, largely on the back of the Presario's consumer success, Compaq officially surpassed IBM to become the undisputed #1 personal computer manufacturer in the world.
On the surface, if you are just looking at top-line revenue and market share, Pfeiffer's turnaround looks like a miraculous corporate salvation. But beneath the surface, the internal logistics of the company were fracturing under the strain of this new business model.
They were drowning in their own volume. Historically, Compaq operated on a rigid build-to-inventory system. They would use sales data to forecast market demand. Their massive manufacturing plants would build hundreds of thousands of finished, boxed computers, and they would store them in sprawling warehouses, waiting for their retail dealers to place orders.
In the high-margin, slower-moving enterprise market of the 1980s, building to inventory was standard practice. But in the hyper-competitive, fast-paced, price-slashing consumer environment of the 1990s, building to inventory was financial suicide.
Because the components inside a PC, the processors, the memory, the hard drives were depreciating in value by the week as newer, faster parts hit the market.
Right. If Compaq's forecasters misjudged consumer demand by even a few percentage points, the company was suddenly stuck holding warehouses full of rapidly depreciating, obsolete assets that they would eventually have to sell at a massive loss just to clear space.
To stop this bleeding, Compaq attempted to radically shift their entire global manufacturing base to a build-to-order system, where they would hold stockpiles of raw components and only assemble the final machine as orders came in from the retailers.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
It's like trying to rebuild the engine of a race car while you're currently driving it at 150 miles per hour. You have an entrenched corporate culture, thousands of supply chain employees, and a global network of retail dealers who are all structurally optimized for one specific way of doing business, and you are demanding they rewire the entire operation on the fly just to survive these shrinking profit margins.
And this logistical trauma permanently altered Compaq's DNA.
Yeah.
They fundamentally transitioned away from being a high-margin engineering pioneer, the elite team that successfully reverse-engineered the IBM BIOS and beat IBM to the 386 chip.
They mutated into a high-volume, low-margin commodity hardware vendor.
And the brutal reality of commodity hardware is that when your primary market differentiator becomes your low price, you are forced to sell massive, ever-increasing volumes just to maintain stagnant revenue growth.
It's a treadmill that constantly accelerates. Pfeiffer looked at the financial projections and realized that the consumer PC market was a race to the bottom. To escape the gravity of these shrinking margins, he decided that Compaq needed to buy its way into the highly lucrative, high-margin world of enterprise IT services and mini-computers.
This marks the era of fatal corporate hubris. In the late 1990s, flushed with cash from their massive market share, Compaq embarks on an unprecedented, highly aggressive acquisition spree.
In 1997, they spent $4 billion to acquire Tandem Computers.
Right. Tandem was highly specialized. They built fail-safe, highly redundant servers that ran critical infrastructure like global banking systems and ATM networks.
Strategically, you can argue the logic of the Tandem acquisition. It gives Compaq a foothold in high-end enterprise servers. But then, in January 1998, Pfeiffer executes what was, at the time, the single largest acquisition in the history of the computer industry. Compaq buys Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, for a staggering $9 billion.
We must rigorously break down exactly why the DEC merger was a catastrophic, structurally fatal miscalculation. On paper, to a Wall Street analyst, Pfeiffer's logic was straightforward. Compaq needed a massive, established services organization to compete directly with IBM for highly lucrative multi-year corporate consulting and support contracts.
DEC brought a 22,000-person global service and consulting workforce to the table.
But DEC was not just a consulting firm. They were a massive, sprawling, legacy technology conglomerate carrying immense, outdated baggage. DEC manufactured their own highly proprietary microprocessors called alpha chips.
The Alpha architecture was entirely, fundamentally incompatible with Compaq's core, multi-billion-dollar Intel-based business.
Exactly. DEC built massive, refrigerator-sized mini-computers running deeply proprietary operating systems like VMS and legacy versions of Unix. Meanwhile, Compaq's entire corporate strategy was heavily aligned with Microsoft to push Windows NT as a standard for corporate servers.
The sheer scale of the misalignment is staggering. Compaq was a nimble, high-volume vendor of standardized Windows Intel boxes. DEC was a heavy, slow-moving manufacturer of proprietary, high-margin, low-volume legacy systems. They were two fundamentally opposed corporate organisms.
It was a disaster.
Didn't anyone at the executive level realize they were chaining themselves to a sinking ship? DEC was a legendary engineering powerhouse in the 70s and 80s, but by the late 90s, they had completely missed the open systems revolution. They were bleeding cash. Why did Pfeiffer force this merger through?
Well, internal accounts reveal that there was massive opposition, but it was actively suppressed by the leadership. The documents note that Robert Stearns, Compaq's senior vice president for business development, loudly and repeatedly opposed the acquisition of DEC.
He saw it coming.
He argued that the cultural and technological divides were simply too vast to bridge. His reward for that foresight was being marginalized. Stearns reported that he was placed on the B team by Pfeiffer and effectively shut out of the strategic integration process for voicing his concerns.
And the resulting integration was an unmitigated disaster. The financial toll was immediate. Compaq was forced to take a staggering $3.6 billion charge against earnings in 1998 just to cover the costs associated with the acquisition and restructuring.
They announced brutal layoffs. 15,000 employees were purged from DEC and another 2,000 from legacy Compaq.
The layoffs induced total organizational paralysis. The structural misalignment led to deeply inefficient product rollouts, constant infighting over which technologies to prioritize, missed deadlines, and a complete collapse in employee morale.
Furthermore, DEC's legacy businesses actively infuriated Compaq's most critical strategic partners. Microsoft, for instance, had spent years working with Compaq to make Windows NT the dominant standard for corporate servers.
Suddenly, Microsoft executives are watching their primary hardware partner spend billions to acquire and support DEC's legacy Unix systems, which were directly competing against Windows NT.
Compaq completely lost its identity. If you asked an analyst in 1999 what Compaq actually was, they couldn't give you a straight answer. Were they a low-cost, direct-to-consumer PC maker battling for shelf space at Best Buy?
Were they a high-end enterprise systems consulting firm trying to undercut IBM?
Were they a microprocessor manufacturer trying to keep the alpha chip alive?
They attempted to be everything to everyone, and as a direct result of that lack of focus, they became vulnerable in their core foundational market. And this executive distraction proved fatal.
Because while Compaq's leadership was choking on the DEC acquisition, dealing with endless internal politics, massive layoffs, and furious partners, a new competitor was quietly and ruthlessly rewriting the fundamental laws of retail logistics right behind their backs.
Enter Michael Dell. And to understand Dell's disruption, we have to look at the structural inefficiency of Compaq's retail model. Dell perfected a direct-to-consumer, build-to-order logistics machine. Dell did not have hundreds of expensive retail stores. They did not have to pay massive margins to authorized dealers.
If you wanted a Dell, you called a 1-800 number, or increasingly in the late 90s, you logged onto their website and you configured exactly the computer you wanted.
The financial mechanics of this model are revolutionary. Dell didn't order the parts or build the machine until they already had the customer's credit card authorization in hand.
This meant Dell carried virtually zero finished inventory. They weren't paying to store computers in warehouses. They weren't paying retail markups.
The systemic financial impact of this efficiency is staggering. Dell's operating costs were roughly 18%. That was approximately half of the operating costs required to run a traditional retail-heavy PC seller like Compaq.
Let's investigate the paralysis here. If you are sitting in the Compaq boardroom and you can plainly see Dell completely destroying your margins on the internet with operating costs that are half of yours,
Why not just bite the bullet?
Right, why not cut off the retailers, suffer the short-term financial pain, and transition the entire company to a digital direct-to-consumer model?
Because you are dealing with the intractable problem of channel conflict. Compaq was entirely structurally tethered to its massive network of authorized retail dealers. For over 15 years, Compaq had promised these dealers, contractually and culturally, that they would never sell direct and bypass them.
And these retail partners still accounted for the vast, overwhelming majority of Compaq's global revenue. If Compaq's executives suddenly launched a heavily discounted direct sales website to compete with Dell, the retail partners would revolt instantly.
They would drop the Compaq brand, refuse to allocate shelf space to their products, and heavily promote competitors instead. So the executives were held hostage by their own legacy of success. Taking the necessary steps to compete with Dell would have looked like instant, catastrophic corporate suicide to the shareholders in the short term.
Dell, meanwhile, was an entirely new entity, unburdened by legacy retail relationships, allowing them to ride the wave of internet commerce seamlessly.
And the logistical feedback loop was vicious. Dell was purchasing components at real-time market prices, building the machine and shipping it in days. As the cost of hard drives and memory plummeted, Dell immediately passed those savings on to the consumer by lowering their website prices.
Meanwhile, Compaq's retailers were sitting on inventory that Compaq had built and shipped 3 months prior, using more expensive components.
To clear this increasingly obsolete stock and compete with Dell's prices, the retailers were forced to dump excess Compaq stock at absurdly low, heavily discounted prices, which systematically destroyed Compaq's profit margins and severely degraded their premium brand value.
And as if the supply chain disaster wasn't enough to break the company, we have to factor in the ultimate strategic betrayal by Intel. Remember, in the 1980s, Compaq's engineering dominance helped legitimize Intel's 386 chips.
But in the 1990s, Intel launched their massive, globally ubiquitous Intel Inside marketing campaign. Intel spent hundreds of millions of dollars convincing the global consumer base that the only component that actually mattered in a computer was the Intel processor inside it.
This campaign fundamentally shifted brand loyalty from the hardware manufacturer to the component supplier. But the fatal blow came when Intel decided to expand their own manufacturing scope. Intel didn't just want to sell processors anymore. They began manufacturing their own complete, optimized motherboards and chipsets in massive volumes.
This entirely negated Compaq's historical advantage. In the 1980s, Compaq's value proposition lay in their elite engineers designing superior, custom motherboards and advanced system architectures around the Intel chip.
Exactly. But once Intel started selling complete, highly reliable motherboards to anyone who wanted to buy them, the barrier to entry in the PC market dropped to zero.
Any small regional company or even an individual hobbyist could buy a standardized Intel motherboard, slap an Intel CPU into a generic metal case, install Microsoft Windows, and sell a machine that was functionally identical to a Compaq, but for hundreds of dollars less.
The vaunted proprietary engineering edge that defined Compaq and justified their premium prices vanished almost overnight. The personal computer had become a pure commodity. A Compaq PC was now just a plastic box wrapping someone else's technology.
This perfect storm of structural failures, the DEC disaster, the Dell supply chain disruption, and the Intel commoditization, is perfectly highlighted by the Y2K bug panic of 1999.
In the late 90s, massive corporations and government agencies were terrified that older computer systems would crash when the calendar rolled over to the year 2000, so they went on an unprecedented, panic-driven hardware buying spree. It was an absolute gold rush for the tech industry.
Competitors like Dell, Gateway, Hewlett-Packard, and IBM all saw massive surges in their hardware sales as they reaped the benefits of this artificial demand spike.
And yet the internal financials show that Compaq's core PC sales actually dropped during 1999. They entirely failed to capitalize on the single biggest hardware purchasing boom of the decade because their manufacturing supply chain was a convoluted, inefficient mess, and their attempts to launch a direct order initiative to bypass retailers were half-hearted and fundamentally broken.
The financial bleeding became impossible for the board to ignore. The structural rot finally reached the highest levels of leadership, leading to a brutal reckoning in early 1999. The internal dysfunction violently spilled into public view.
Chief Financial Officer Earl Mason was forced to resign under intense fire after a scandal involving the selective disclosure of pessimistic financial results to certain favored Wall Street analysts before the public.
The SEC investigation and the subsequent loss of institutional trust was the final catalyst. Shortly thereafter, in April 1999, the board of directors, once again led by the ruthless chairman Ben Rosen, forced CEO Eckhard Pfeiffer to resign.
The architect of the DEC merger was gone. The company was hemorrhaging cash, losing market share, and completely rudderless.
The board turns to Michael Capellas, promoting him from his role as Chief Information Officer directly into the CEO chair in July 1999. Capellas inherits an absolute disaster, and he tries to aggressively right the ship.
He initiates a massive internal reorganization, desperately trying to focus the bloated conglomerate on the burgeoning e-commerce sector. He pushes the company to adopt a new, desperate mantra demanding they operate at internet speed.
But the macroeconomic timing could not possibly have been worse. Just as Capellas is attempting to drag this fragmented, bleeding conglomerate into the digital age, a catastrophic market correction occurs.
The dot-com bubble bursts.
During the late 90s, thousands of heavily funded, highly speculative internet startups were buying massive amounts of premium server and networking equipment from Compaq, burning through their venture capital with zero regard for profitability.
When the venture capital dried up and the bubble violently popped in 2000 and 2001, these startups went bankrupt by the thousands.
The systemic fallout for Compaq was twofold, and both elements were devastating. First, Compaq instantly lost a massive segment of their most reliable, high-margin enterprise customer base.
Second, and far more damaging, the liquidation of these thousands of failed startups flooded the secondary market with millions of perfectly good, slightly used, heavily discounted enterprise servers and computers.
It is exactly like a flash flood destroying a dam. You've spent years and billions of dollars building this massive, beautiful dam to capture all the water-acquiring DEC, building immense server manufacturing capacity, targeting these .coms.
And then the dam bursts.
Washing away your customer base, and suddenly you are drowning in a flood of your own excess liquidated inventory. Compaq wasn't just competing with Dell's supply chain anymore. They were competing against their own heavily discounted, perfectly viable products being sold for pennies on the dollar on the used market.
The deterioration of their market capitalization was absolute and unavoidable. By early 2002, Compaq stock was trading at roughly 1/4 of the value it held during the optimistic peak of the DEC merger era.
At the end of 1999, Compaq boasted a market capitalization of $43 billion. Just a few short years later, their margins had evaporated, their identity was fractured, and they were fighting a losing battle for basic corporate survival.
This severe systemic weakness paved the way for the end of Compaq as an independent sovereign entity. In 2002, entirely out of runway, they entered into a highly controversial $24.2 billion merger with their longtime industry rival Hewlett-Packard.
And the historical consensus on that merger remains deeply critical. We must analyze whether this was a genuine, synergistic, strategic move by HP's leadership to consolidate market share, or whether it was simply two drowning legacy hardware companies desperately grabbing onto each other in a panic as Dell continued to erode their foundations.
Many industry analysts argue that absorbing Compaq's fragmented supply chain and the remaining DEC baggage created immense, long-term structural and cultural damage for HP.
The integration of the two massive workforces was brutal, characterized by tens of thousands of layoffs and years of internal friction. And ultimately, it was a slow, agonizing admission of defeat for the Compaq lineage.
By 2013, HP entirely discontinued the Compaq brand, the name that once fundamentally defined the bleeding edge of personal computing. The company that shattered IBM's monopoly was quietly and unceremoniously erased from the market.
When we step back and distill the findings of this corporate autopsy, the duality of Compaq's legacy is striking. They were undeniably a vital pioneer. They successfully broke IBM's monopolistic grip on the industry through brilliant legal and engineering maneuvering.
They proved the viability and ultimately the superiority of a competitive clone market. And they successfully defended the entire industry from returning to proprietary lock-in by championing the ISA standard.
But their downfall was equally absolute and entirely self-inflicted. They were undone by bloated, reactive, poorly integrated acquisitions like DEC.
They were paralyzed by a structural inability to adapt to the brutally efficient direct-to-consumer logistics pioneered by Dell.
And they were ultimately hollowed out by the relentless commoditization of their own core technology by their former partners at Intel and Microsoft.
The systemic vulnerability was baked into their business model. They built a massive premium infrastructure on top of hardware components that were rapidly becoming cheap commodities.
And this is the critical takeaway for you if you're analyzing corporate longevity. This autopsy proves that past success, especially success built on massive logistical networks like retail channels, is the absolute greatest enemy of future innovation.
Clinging defensively to a business model that generated billions yesterday can and will systematically destroy you tomorrow when the macroeconomic environment or the technological realities change.
Long-term survival requires the ruthless willingness to cannibalize your own legacy systems to burn your own successful business models to the ground before a leaner, faster competitor does it for you.
Compaq's leadership could not bring themselves to bypass the dealers who built them, and Dell exploited that specific hesitation flawlessly.
We leave you with this final, lingering paradox to consider. Compaq fought tooth and nail in the 1980s, leading the Gang of Nine, to keep the PC architecture fundamentally open so that anyone could build compatible machines.
They defeated IBM's proprietary closed system, and in doing so, they saved the industry.
But it was exactly that open, democratized standard that eventually allowed Intel to commoditize the motherboards and allowed Dell to assemble and sell those commodities faster and cheaper. In the end, the very weapon Compaq brilliantly forged to slay IBM was the exact same weapon that ultimately killed Compaq.